Okay, so we're going to get started, everyone. I'm Kyle Cleveland with Temple University, Japan. This event is being organized through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. And I would like to thank Ron Zwiegenberg in particular, because the event has really come together through his network and through his impetus. Ron had given a presentation at the university maybe 3 years ago on the history of castles in Japan. And we have been in touch. I guess one of the starting points for this was Malcolm Gladwell, who you may know as the New Yorker writer and best-selling author, has published a new book called The Bomber Mafia about Curtis LeMay and the prelude to the firebombing of Tokyo. And in response to that, Aaron Moore and Ron Zwiegenberg wrote an essay called History at 30,000 Feet, which is in Counterpunch. You can see a link to that in the chat session. So what we're going to do this evening is each panelist will speak for 10 or so minutes, and then we'll have a kind of a roundtable type session. If you could please at any time put in a concise question, we'll go through those to have an extended Q&A after they've started speaking. Just by way of brief introduction here, I'm not going to read through their entire profiles, but Aaron Moore is at the University of Edinburgh. He is the Honda Chair of Japanese-Chinese Relations. Princeton University has had postdoctoral positions, Harvard and Oxford. And he is the author of a book called Writing War and also Bombing the City. And has written and studied extensively on the issues we'll be addressing tonight. Sayaka Chitani is at the National University of Singapore. She's an assistant professor and presidential youth professor at the Department of History. Her specialty is in the social history of Japanese imperialism, particularly youth mobilization. And in association with that, she's the author of a book entitled Nation Empire, Ideology and Rural Youth Mobilization in Japan and its Colonies, which won a number of awards. Ron Zwiegenberg is at Pennsylvania State University. He's an associate professor there whose work focuses on modern Japanese and European history with specialization in memory and heritage. He's taught around the world and is the author of Hiroshima, The Origins of Global Memory Culture. And also he spoke about this at our university a few years ago, a book entitled Japan's Castles, Citadels of Modernity and War and Peace. So each of these scholars will give a rather brief presentation, and then we'll go into the discussion. Please consult the chat session for some links related to what they're talking about. And Sayaka, if you would like to get started, you can share your screen.
Sure. Thank you, Kyle, for introducing us, and thank you everyone for coming. My name is Sayaka Chitani, and let me just share the screen. Okay, so I'm a researcher of Japanese imperialism, and obviously that leads up to World War II, and especially the end of war. And recently I started doing research on Korean residents in Japan in post-war society, so they're called Zainichi Koreans. So in a nutshell, I've been interested in this long array of imperialism of the 20th century, and wartime comes right in the middle of that. And that's also a turning point, but at the same time, it's kind of distinct in that it shows a continuity in imperialism. So what we do, historians of empire in our field, do not necessarily link together with the memory of war, which is very interesting phenomenon and some concerning phenomenon at the same time. So I'd like to sort of use this opportunity to try to link the two together. And so the first, I want to raise three questions. And the first one is about linking all these different fields, which should be overlapping, but not in reality. So the first question I'm asking is, how do we link the long history of empires and the memory of war? So when you read the literature on the public memory of wartime aggression and victimhood in Japan, you will get to read a lot about analysis of the victim discourse of or the people believing themselves, regarding themselves as mainly as victims, victim heroes rather than aggressors, and forgetting about the wartime aggression in Asia, in China, Southeast Asia. So bringing back the history of empires into this discourse it should be done at least now. So that's the first question. And the second question is actually about, did it end imperialism? It's about the other side of the ocean, American discourse. So there's a certain sense of savior mentality that's discussed in justification of dropping the A-bomb, the A-bombs, and doing carpet bombing in industrial cities in Japan. But at the same time, this savior mentality, basically meaning unless we dropped these bombs, we couldn't have saved all these innocent lives in Asia or in Japan, and then stop Japanese militarism and Japanese aggression. But at the same time, did it end imperialism? World War II was about imperial competition from the very beginning, but there's no discussion about the impact of this bombing on the end of imperialism or continuation of imperialism at all. So this is, again, has to be challenged. So that's my second question. And the third question is about how to think about this interwar period as a history. So this period, we all see the intense mobilization, ideological indoctrination throughout the world. It's not just Japan, but Japan was part of it. So if we think about that's how people were mobilized, and people were very enthusiastic about wartime mobilization everywhere in the world, and at the same time they were exploited due to the massive mass scale of destruction, then how do we think about the victim and also aggressor division, different separation? This is a very complex history. So the question is, how does Japan's intense imperial rule complicate the bomber's savior mentality? Okay, so I want to start by showing what we know, which is the breadth of Japanese imperialism. And we all know that by early 1942, Japan's territorial control reached its peak. And this is actually a map of US Navy and showing how massive Japan became, and used the slogan of Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. What I want to emphasize is that it's not just the breadth, but there was depth in Japanese imperial rule, especially in older colonies like Taiwan, Korea, Okinawa, even many colonial peripheries in Japan, or colonized peripheries in the Japanese metropole. So what that means is that the Japanese used many techniques of nation building or ideological mobilization in the empire as well. So in my case, this is an advertisement of my book, and I call it Nation Empire to express this intensity of ideological mobilization. But because I look at rural youth mobilization in the colonial peripheries, I see that there's a very strong sense of belief in state ideology, in my case, agrarianism, which was instilled through intimate encounters with each other among youth, or with Japanese colonial instructors in youth training, even in the colonial countryside. And at the same time, during this interwar period, modernity hit society. So they saw a lot of transformations in social fabric. So that impacted how they viewed themselves, how they felt the sense of belonging to their own ethnic group or to the Japanese empire, so that there was a lot of shuffling. So combined together, these forces led to a certain sense of enthusiasm coming from many sectors of this wide imperial society. And in that society, especially after Japan started an all-in war in 1937 against China, and war mobilization became, reached another stage of total mobilization, then people had this sense of desire for self-mobilization, mutual policing and also state coercion became sort of mashed together. It was inseparable from people's point of view. And towards the end of war, this enthusiasm and atmosphere led to escalated to wartime abuse and exploitation, especially of those in colonial peripheries. So I just want to show some of the evidence that I have to discuss this process. When I talk about enthusiasm, I usually show this colonial volunteer soldier fever. So the empire started to recruit colonial youth in 1938 in Korea and in 1942 in Japan. And as you can see, the program was very competitive, especially in Taiwan, and it was very popular. And there were a lot of testimonies that show that many rural youth wanted to become this volunteer soldier, and it was very special as an experience. And I spent more than 300 pages to talk about this complex process of generating enthusiasm around this mobilization. So I'll give you 2 pointers. One is that they had new emotions coming from the new social bonding with the youth group members or youth training members or the instructors. And at the same time, they had a grave new sense of social marginalization. And in my case, their marginalization came from the stark division between the urban centers and underdeveloped rural countryside. But it could happen in any social cleavage. It could be gender, it could be generations, class, educated, uneducated. So those people who felt they were marginalized considered wartime mobilization as a total game changer in the social hierarchy. So I put short quotes here from my work. One is from my interviewee in Korea. He kept saying this: volunteer soldiers boasted of their high status so much, so indicating that becoming a volunteer soldier was a total game changer in the rural countryside in Korea. Another quote came from a memoir of a Korean volunteer soldier, which said, "My motto was to be an exemplary Japanese soldier. I was obsessed with the idea I shall not lose to Japanese people." So again, this is a convoluted sense of ethnic pride and self-esteem in a sense, showing that they are superior. He is a superior being to Japanese soldiers by becoming an ideal Japanese soldier. So as you can see, this is the mechanism of sort of intensifying enthusiasm. But at the same time, as I said, that enthusiasm led to a massive scale of exploitation of colonial being, colonial subject. And I think this graph captures the intensity of that very well. So this is a number of registered Korean residents in Japan. And as you can see, there's a sharp rise between 1940 and 1945, and they were mainly labor conscripts, so basically free laborers or labor slaves. And there's numerous accounts of how abusive the system was. They were starving. They had to do dangerous job in coal mines and war factories, and they had no freedom to go out, and they were injured, and they were beaten to death if they tried to escape. So it was really a difficult situation for Korean labor slaves here. So it was not a coincidence that when Americans started bombing over Japanese industrial cities, there were many Korean people living in those cities. For example, in Hiroshima city, there was an estimate of 70,000 Koreans living in Hiroshima city before the atomic bomb. And interestingly, in the 1960s, only 5,000 Korean residents registered as hibakusha or atomic bomb victims. And this is a certificate that is necessary to get benefits, governmental benefits as the victims, but many of them refused to get that hibakusha label. And I found there's a lot of discrimination and marginalization in post-war Japan And some of the quotes I put here might be quite telling. I don't tell others that my family got Pika. Pika is a bomb. Living as Koreans is already excruciating. We cannot find a job as Pika victims. And I cannot stay in the hospital even if it is free. Who will provide for my children? So this marginalization in Japanese society is obviously a fault by Japanese people and the Japanese public. But at the same time, Japan was under the American occupation until 1952. And the US occupation really set the tone of social marginalization and demonization of Korean people because they were very left-leaning. For example, 1948, the US occupation cracked down on hundreds of Korean schools that were independently run by Korean people. And the following year, the Korean League, it was massively popular by Zainichi Koreans, were ordered to close because they were left-leaning. And at the end of the US occupation in 1952, Japan signed the San Francisco Treaty with many countries, and through which Japan regained the status as an independent nation. But with the same treaty stripped these former colonial subjects of the Japanese nationality, even if they still lived in Japan. So what that means is because Japan did not have diplomatic relationship with either South or North Korea, so these people living in Japan, especially Koreans, were rendered stateless without protection. So what I'm just trying to wrap up here. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just about forgetting of this particular group of people, Koreans living in Japan, but basically there is no discourse, there is no section of understanding of longue durée of imperialism that went through this war bombing in the discussion of wartime discourse or war memory discourse. So I want to stop here, but I want to continue this discussion, and I'm happy to answer any question later.
Great, thank you, Sayaka.
Did I stop the, okay, stop sharing.
Yeah. Okay, Aaron, if you could share your screen. Yeah, we can see it fine.
Okay, I assume you can hear me now, all right?
Yes, everything's good.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to a broader audience about these issues. And I'm glad that we asked Sayaka to begin this because she's able to raise some of the issues that I won't have time to raise, but spoke a little bit about in my first book, not as extensively as she did in her book, but bringing the empire back into war history is quite important. And it's something that we've seen in a lot of recent historiographies in Europe as well. Okay, so in this talk, I want to focus our attention on the accounts of survivors of the air war in the cities. And I want to do that to make two simple points that I think need careful consideration among scholars and non-specialists alike. First of all, civilians who experienced bombing often rallied to defend the city, which made them targets of enemy violence. Second, this phenomenon occurred throughout the Allied and Axis powers, wherein we can see, I guess, what you might call a great convergence of popular mobilization and systematic mass killing on both sides of the conflict. So drawing from my recent book, Bombing the City, I want to explore the similarity of civilian experiences between Imperial Japan and Great Britain, and how urban space became a nexus for this convergence. Kenneth Hewitt argued that cities cannot be fully comprehended as merely a set of special relations, biophysical habitat, and impersonal socioeconomic functions. While a city is effectively a dead heap of concrete, wood, and glass, those materials are, as he puts it, shaped into places by the personal works, exchanges, and intelligent participation of resident communities. So the bombing war tore away the city's skin, revealing the tunnels carrying water and human waste, pipes delivering poisonous flammable gas, and wires that crackled with deadly electricity. And yet, despite the devastation of the city, which killed its own residents in fiery piles of metal, stone, and wood, the citizens continued to sacrifice themselves to save it, which in turn kept the war machine going. So the bomber always gets through, or so said Stanley Baldwin, and that meant that urban residents had to patch themselves up as best they could. On top of the inadequacy of air defenses, however, the febrile net of professional staff, medical instruments, and supply routes were all smashed by the Allied bombing campaign and Axis bombing campaign over Britain. In Britain, in a Bristol hospital, patients and nurses sang to calm the nerves of those panicked by the air attacks until a bomb blasted the nurses off their feet and blew a patient into a bed in another room. An infirmary near Liverpool was hit so hard by a bomb that it annihilated 3 hospital buildings in one stroke. It buried patients under the rubble and set fire to everything, including the ambulances. In Manchester, one hospital was nearly annihilated, and patients fell through 4 floors to the basement below. Ambulances in a lot of these regional cities, which were lightly defended compared to Tokyo and London, were pulled out of the bombed cities to save them, leaving the injured stranded in the city. Japanese hospitals during the war were so overwhelmed by bombing that they began to simply offer palliative care to the dying. To add insult to injury, hospitals suffered interference from the armed forces in Japan. Injured civilians were told, soldiers first, those with external wounds next, burns last. That meant that burn victims would sit in excruciating pain, squatting in crowded hallways littered with sleeping and dying people. Japanese civilians frequently watched their neighbors die in hospital, including children. One survivor recalled a pregnant woman going into labor in a wrecked hospital, but she had taken shrapnel in her stomach. There was no maternity ward, so she gave birth in a corner in the hospital, and when the baby didn't cry, she cried out, "Where's my baby?" But the nurse remained silent. When she failed to deliver her afterbirth, they searched desperately for a doctor only to find a veterinarian. The city, with all of its spectacular modernity then, including promises of scientific hygiene and modern medicine, was unable to protect the lives of its residents. Yet doctors patched them up as best they could, and many of them went right back to sustaining the wartime economy. Another serious consequence of the deconstruction of British and Japanese cities due to bombing was the loss of housing for millions of people. And in Britain, citizens in regional cities like Swansea, Hull, Bristol, and Coventry discovered that the loss of housing could be much more devastating than the capital, where housing stock was plentiful. After the attack on Swansea, Laurie Latchford described how, quote, houses had been shattered by high explosive bombs, modern villas stripped of their tiles, others the roof timbering sliding earthwards to cover the shattered walls, bedding, pictures, rugs, chairs, and broken debris, all in one great pile. Later, he encountered a stunned-looking family of 3 wandering the streets, watching the searchlights and shell bursts. Advising them to take shelter, the father simply said they had nowhere to go. And I think this is one of the problems we have when we do comparisons. We say, well, Japanese cities were wood and therefore flammable, and they suffered more. And that's true, but there's a kind of superficial resilience to the British cities that isn't borne out when you look at the civilian accounts where they talk about simply having nowhere to live. Manchester citizens fled bombing south to the Cheshire Plains, camping in fields and becoming, in the view of some mass observers, nearly seditious in their antagonistic views of the leadership in London. The flammable material used in Japanese homes did certainly make them easier targets of bombers, which meant that even more people were rendered homeless by the bombing attacks. Unfortunately for people like Inabafuku, her family's home was in Chiba, which was a center of military industrial production and thus a tempting target. While all of her relatives were able to fit safely into a shelter during an air raid, she could hear the bombs falling around the neighborhood. And she wrote in her memoir, "My 9-year-old brother was at the shelter entrance when the whine of falling bombs could be heard, and then he quickly leapt outside. Before long, it was quiet. Up above, my brother screamed, 'The house is gone.' No way, I thought, and went outside to look. Gone. Our house, the one in front of it, and all around, there wasn't a single building that was sound. About 6 meters away from the shelter, there was a gaping hole in the ground and just nothing." Now, years later, Fuku could not find the right words to describe the sensation of having her entire neighborhood wiped out in a single attack, writing, "It just disappeared, it was blown away, or it flew up into heaven." Citizens felt that they had no choice but to leave their belongings behind and flee for the countryside, often with very little in their rucksacks apart from some food, some cash, and insurance policies that were unlikely ever to be honored. Nevertheless, most came back and tried to rebuild the ruins as their war work went on. For those who managed to escape the city, wrecked food distribution networks meant that further survival would be challenging on multiple fronts. Although Britain and Japan observed rationing measures, food supply was still filtered through a pre-existing for-profit system of shops, which presented inefficiencies and limitations. Furthermore, food shortages were not shared by all equally. Rural people fared better than urban, the wealthy better than the poor, and capital city residents were given preference. Bertram Elwood, who took a day trip from Birmingham to London, remarked in his diary, quote, "After the empty cake shops of Birmingham, it is refreshing and somewhat annoying too to see the London shop windows crammed to overflowing with cakes and pastries in almost as profuse a variety as before the war." Residents of regional cities suspected that Londoners and Tokyoites did not share in their struggles for, whether that's fair or not. That's the perception. While the main cause of the food shortage were wartime disruptions to production or labor shortages, in some cases, the distribution system itself was arbitrary, corrupt, or simply wrecked. Food crises combined with air raids to result in looting, hoarding, and other extreme behavior. Food theft was common across Japan in the war years, even involving stealing from children. In Britain, shortages and shortcomings in the rationing system were infamous, and shopkeepers sometimes played favorites concerning who they would sell goods to. Rescue workers rummaged through wardrobes and drawers and kitchens in bombed homes, and the landlords of buildings decided to look the other way. Much has been said about the comradeship of the Blitz, one woman observed, but it also has a dark side. When shopkeepers fled or found their businesses destroyed, the state in Britain and Japan turned to the cooperative system to manage crisis rationing. During the destruction of Coventry, Levi Fox's diary detailed the vicissitudes of trying to supply a city with much needed bread when the entire system of distribution had been destroyed from the air. Listing all of the bakeries out of commission, Fox glumly concluded, "Assumed that the co-op mutual aid scheme was working, but an unconfirmed report was picked to effect that last night only 1/2 of a loaf of bread was being allowed per person by the co-op." Aojima Tokuji was in charge of the Shizuoka Prefecture Rationing Division, and his 1945 description of the impact of enemy bombing on food provisions reveals how fragile the systems for feeding the city people were. First, Aojima pointed out that Allied bombing destroyed much of Japan's food processing infrastructure, such as their facilities for polishing and preparing white rice for mass consumption. Distribution centers, staff, and their housing all suffered 75 to 90% losses, resulting in what he described as a state of complete shock and paralysis. Both Britain and Japan were industrialized maritime empires that could not feed themselves. Nevertheless, citizens stuck with the city, even as it starved them. "Daddy has become so thin," observed Victoria Mond in Bristol, "that his gold ring slipped off and became embedded in the soap." If in peacetime the city was an alluring center of light and life, and indeed power, in wartime it became something more sinister. The heat of air raid fires caused strange and disturbing phenomena, such as burning bricks, melting streets, and plagues of pests. With so many casualties piling up in Britain and Japan, the city struggled to dispose of its numerous corpses. In Kofu, Ueno Kosaku was a section head of the Municipal Civil Defense Unit, and as part of his duties, he had to dispose of dead bodies across the city. He described how they first burned each body and then loaded them onto trucks, 5 or 8 bodies per vehicle. Ueno recalled how some people had simply quit the job, and others, even during a time of food shortage, would not eat their lunches, simply retching over and over. For days after the November 1940 air raid on Coventry, the British Army deployed thousands of Irish conscripts to exhume the bodies of those who were buried by the bombing, and then bury them again in a mass grave as citizens looked on. Gladys Hollingsworth wrote despondently in her diary how Coventry was, quote, "smashed to destruction in a single night. Can anyone imagine such a prosperous, thriving industrial center and 10 hours later, a graveyard and a rubbish heap?" So to conclude, it's probably fair, or it's probably time we stopped calling the Second World War the Good War, considering the incalculable pain and loss it inflicted on ordinary people. Despite assertions of irreconcilable difference, the more we hated each other, the more alike we became. The rationalization of war industries, the censorship of the press, internment of foreigners, the organization of society into clusters like women's associations and youth groups, the rationing systems and requisitioning of civilian goods, the loss of entertainment and recreation, and so on and so on. Our current rising nostalgia for the war years is based on myopic and Manichaean visions of resilience, unity, and heroism against evil, which cannot represent the totality of experience of being bombed. The city was a system designed by humans to be a glorious center of modern civilization, but in the heat of the war, it turned into a deadly beast. Burning buildings, ruined water supply, collapsed food stores, and exploding gas mains were just obvious manifestations of this creature's deadly grasp. This is fitting, as the city was the engine of the war machine itself. People loved their cities just like they loved their nations, but in both cases, it was an unrequited love. And it was this love, in fact, that sustained the war machine's engine, feeding it the men and material it needed to inflict the same suffering on other people elsewhere. And I'll just conclude there and pass over to my colleague, Ron. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaron.
Thank you, Aaron. Start. Okay, so I want to first thank both Sayaka and Aaron for their great presentation. And I want to say that it's very important for me that we have that kind of event on August 6th, because one of the most important things, at least for me, in the last couple of years, is to try to integrate Hiroshima and August 6th into a much longer history. Because Hiroshima was both, as I see it, and as I'm going to argue now, was the peak and a continuation of the bombing campaign, but also Hiroshima was an imperial center. From Hiroshima, the troops that went to Korea, went to China, departed from the Sino-Japanese War on. And a lot of victims of the bomb were not Japanese, even though this day is celebrated as a Japanese day of mourning, Japanese day of victimization. Japanese were victims, but history is much more complex. So we're going to talk about this much more later on in the round table, but for now, I want to concentrate here on what I call bombing the Japanese mind, and for us to think about the bomb as a part of a psychological campaign against Japan. I want to start with three quotes you see here, one by a Japanese psychiatrist in 1936, the second by Heinrich Himmler in 1937, and a third a quote of a commander in the US Army Air Force about the destruction of Japan, urban areas. In all those three quotes, you see the emphasis, and you can read it faster than I can read it to you. You can see the emphasis that combatants in all areas, in all sides of World War I put on the mind and the spirit. Japanese, of course, were well known in their reliance on superior so-called spirit, Germans as well, but also is less known that the bombing campaign was really, a lot of it was, at least one of the main justification was about targeting morale, about bombing the Japanese into submission, about destroying their will to resist, aiming at, again, as this commander here said, aiming at the Japanese mind. Now, what I'm going to talk about today actually comes from a book I'm just finishing, which deals with the psychological sciences and the A-bomb. And initially, I didn't think it's going to really deal much with the war, but the more I dig into the involvement of psychology, specifically the background of Japanese psychologists and psychiatrists that worked with Hibakusha, with A-bomb survivors, and the American psychologists that were first sent to Hiroshima as early as September, October 1945, I realized I have to go back, look at the war, and look at the bombing campaign and the A-bomb itself as from the psychological angle. What really drew me into this was the scene that I found out of a bunch of American psychologists, psychiatrists, sociologists running around Hiroshima in 1945. You can see the image over here on the right, them walking around in a jeep and asking Japanese survivors about their experiences. I was fascinated by this scene, so close to the bombing, so raw were probably the emotions there. And I was really fascinated and was really intrigued by what they found. Those people belonged to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, whose job was to evaluate the bombing. It worked both in Germany, in Japan. It was composed, psychology, and psychiatrists were only one part of them. They were part of what's called a morale survey. There was also a medical survey, industrial survey, economic survey, engineering. They really wanted to evaluate how efficient American bombing was. That was done in order to better prepare America for the next war. And in here, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were very important. But initially, Hiroshima and Nagasaki surveys were not seen as something separate from surveying of the bigger experience, a bigger campaign of bombing. in Japan. Now, also, a lot of the initial finding of the USSPS in Germany were used or was hoped they will be used. It's not very clear how much influence those people had eventually. We can go into the details later in the round table in the bombing of Japan. Now, when I speak about morale, when I speak about bombing of the mind, what they really meant, and this is something came out of the survey in Germany, what I call in the book is applied trauma. What they wanted to do was to break the minds of enemy populations, right? In their, for example, so in their surveys in Germany, they meet this German physician who said that the war between the Allies and Nazis was a war of vegetative neurosis. The war have caused this huge epidemic of neurosis, and people were mentally damaged. This was something that a lot of people feared before the Blitz, that the war will produce a large number of mental casualties. And there is this idea that if the more of those people you have, the more you overwhelm people psychologically, eventually people will break and they will turn against their government. For this and for various other reasons, I don't want to say psychology was the only reason, by no means. It was about making them hungry. It's about breaking social bonds, but it's also about just killing people, right? Most of the people who did the bombing did not have such complicated theoretical theories behind them. But the idea was that by bombing civilians enough, you can cause another 1919 in Germany, where the people rose against the government and ended the war. And through the end of the war, you see all those communication in the US Air Force, like, why isn't it happening? Why is the Germans are not revolting against Hitler? Why is the Japanese not revolting against Hitler? But that was the idea. The idea was that by evaluating the bombing, by evaluating what you mean by morale, how do you break morale, you can make it all more scientific. It's all part of the mobilization of the social sciences in order to make the war as a whole more scientific. Now, in the Japanese context, it also have, and that's a completely different conversation, I just want to mention this. Most people who worked in the Japanese mission actually came from the internment camps. Two people I look at very closely in my book are Japanese-American Scotty Matsumoto, who is a sociologist, and a psychiatrist named Alexander Layton, who was the head of the Hiroshima mission. Alexander Layton worked in the internment camp, where he recruited a lot of Japanese-American students who became sociologists. They came with him to OWI, the Office of War Information, where they worked on psychological warfare. Matsumoto and Layton also worked with Rudy Benedict, producing the Christianum and the Sword, a very famous book of Japanese anthropology. This whole thing was part of a whole mission of finding a Japanese national profile. What are the Japanese like? What are Germans like? Why are they aggressive? Why do they go to war against America? This was, ironically, in case you profile a whole nation, part of a very Boasian idea of anthropology that Japanese, German, Americans, they're all basically the same. And they're not different races we cannot understand. This was done in order to perfect, again, make the war scientific, strategies of psychological warfare. Now, what does psychological warfare have to do with napalm? What I do argue is that by bombing was basically psychological warfare via napalm. That by, again, overwhelming people, by causing so much mental anguish, the bombing campaign hoped to achieve some kind of political goal, right? Now, speaking of political goals, another political goal of the bombing of the survey, and this is also something happened much more after the war than during the war, is about demystifying the bomb. It's about making the bomb, the A-bomb, similar to different bombing, right? It's about making the bomb look not so different, than usual bombing, because what they want to do was to keep using the bomb as a regular weapon in warfare, right? This is why, as a side, why the survey came to the conclusion the bomb did not end the war. The regular bombing could have ended the war without it, but it's part of the reasons. And you can see in this quote here one example to this. Now, what did actually they do? They basically went around asking people how they felt about the war. It's kind of like the world's most grotesque opinion poll, right? Can you imagine something? I found this scene so American. You drop a bomb on people and you go around with little clipboards asking them how they felt about it, right? How do you feel about the bomb? What is your bombing experience? And this is not my translation. This is copied from, no, this is their copies. It was in English and in Romanji, right? What is your experience you had? Can you tell me more about your experience? You dropped a bomb on them, right? And you go around asking them how they felt about it. That seems so surreal. But again, the idea is, right, to take those questions, to take those opinion polls, right? The same way that you have all those opinion polls about elections and consumerism, all this come from this world, right? And to make it into a scientific index. And you can see here in some of the examples from the German one, I have a Japanese one, next slide, how much tonnage of bombs will produce how many results, right? And how much tonnage and what kind of impact will have versus countermeasure by the Nazis. In Japan, they already have IBM machines, right? In Japan, they even turn into what's called a morale index, where you get all those questions, right? About how do you feel about your experience, and you get those grades, and you turn into, and you get it into an index and a code, and you punch it in IBM cards, and then you get your computerized graph of how efficient bombing was in terms of destroying people's morales. What's behind the numbers are really horrible stories that you can see I brought to, and Aaron talked much more about this, right? I mean, this is one more way to make the bombing an abstract, to make the civilians on the ground not humans, but an abstract concept, like you're bombing a city. You're bombing an area. You don't bomb, you bomb workers' houses. You don't bomb people. Now, just to wrap up, because I think I already close to the last 10 minutes and really want to talk more. I want to talk a little bit about the heritage of this, about what happened during the war. So there's two main, more than two, but two main places I want to take it, right? The first one is that the people who conducted the survey, a lot of them stayed with the occupation and tried to change Japanese minds, not through bombs, but through democratic reforms. Jennifer Miller wrote this really nice, really great book called Cold War Democracy, which looked at the occupation and Japanese-American relationship through a psychological angle, and about changing Japanese psychology, reforming Japanese psychology. And you see here like a clip from an American propaganda film, Our Job in Japan. Some of you might know it, where they again say our job is in a Japanese mind, right? So you bomb the mind, now you work on the Japanese mind. And the Japanese mind is just like our own, right? Another thing that happened, this is, we can talk about more if you go back to the first quote from Shirabe, the fact that the Japanese themselves and also the Americans had this really high idea about Japanese stamina and spirituality and fighting spirit. There was no really understanding of any kind of long-term mental damage. It was seen that any damage was a temporary and then they could bounce right back. There's a long, and not just in Japan, in Germany as well, in the US, there's there's the denial of long-term mental damage, and we can talk about it later. But the second thing that I want to talk about is the fact that this kind of logic of the A-bomb as a terror weapon was something that continued to the Cold War, okay? The A-bomb was seen, at least in the 40s, before the H-bomb, right? As a terror weapon, as a fact of radiation was seen as a bonus, right? You're going to break nation by stimulating men's primordial fears, unknown, visible, mysterious, again, radiation, right? And this is where Americans are going with this, right? I'm going to skip the last part for the interest of time, but and we can talk about this more, but this is basically where I want to take the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were really superb presentations. Before we go to an open Q&A, I thought we might have a kind of roundtable-like session here, and I will just put a couple of questions to the panelists. And after they respond to that, I will elicit questions from each one of you. Everyone, we don't have that many questions in the chat box. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to input them. So Ron, you alluded to this, and I know you've written and studied on this a lot. This is an auspicious day. It's August 6th, and it's the anniversary of the attacks on Hiroshima and then later Nagasaki. Last year at about this time, I guess it was on August 8th, we did a webinar entitled Managing Nuclear Memory, The Journey from Hiroshima to Fukushima, that had Norma Fields, Bo Jacobs, who's at the Hiroshima Peace Institute, and Yuki Miyamoto talking about the wartime remembrance. And Bo, who's done a lot of work on global hibakusha, is always very conscious about talking about the attacks upon Hiroshima, because the language that we use is very indicative, a kind of passive construction. The bombing of Hiroshima's, a city, this abstract entity was bombed as opposed to attacking, killing people. So Ron, to get started on this, could you talk about how these issues resonate on this day in particular, and the historical trajectory of the victimology studies related to the Hiroshima attacks?
Well, on this day, there's really not much talk about Hiroshima as much more than a victim, I guess. And I guess there's a time to talk about everything, but there is actually, when you go to Hiroshima on this day, actually almost every year I go. This year I didn't go. You mentioned Bo Jacobs. We always go not to the Peace Park, but go to the Atomic Bomb Dome, where you have a lot of different groups who are protesting some of them pressing nuclear power, pressing all sorts of things. But a big part of the demonstration is to talk about the Kagaisha problem, like the victimization issue, that Hiroshima was not just a city of victims, but it was part of a greater war. A big part of this is groups that work for Korean hibakusha, and maybe Sarah can talk about it more, Korean hibakusha rights, both during the war and also after the war. Right? Their memory is completely erased. And this is something that I think should be much more emphasized, the fact that not all victims were Japanese. There's big, not just Korean, there are also a couple of Chinese, Japanese Americans. Naoko Wake wrote a really great book, just came out about American survivors. I mentioned briefly Japanese Americans who were in a very peculiar situation when it comes to.
Ron, what's the name of that book?
I think it's called American Survivors. Naoko Wake. She just came out from Cambridge like this month, I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, Saka, do you want to mention the Korean survivors?
Sure, but I'm also new to this topic. But all I know is that they didn't have any chance to talk about their experience until the 1960s, and there were Korean organizations, Zainichi organizations in Japan, Mindan and Chosen Soren, and neither of them were quite serious about picking up this issue of hibakusha. And some of them went back to South Korea, or they moved to North Korea because they didn't get any sort of easy life in Japan and medical attention. So this sort of victimhood didn't really remain in Hiroshima either. It traveled back to the Korean peninsula, and some of the reporters were reporting about them occasionally, and there were books about them. But at the same time, in the discussion of wartime memory, it just doesn't surface, even since the 1960s. So that's the same.
Can I add also that the surveys excluded Koreans? It's the surveys say you're going to interview only Japanese civilians. You don't interview soldiers, you don't interview Koreans. And if you think about the memory of Hiroshima, it confirms to this. And actually, a lot of the memory testimony, those people are walking around in September 1945, October 1945, and they're taking what is basically testimonies. And those testimonies, some of them became an early, what word in English, like a plate, like a model for later testimony. Especially there is a testimony by a German priest. It became very important in this regard. And the exclusion of Koreans and soldiers is important because Hiroshima was a big military center. But if you think about testimonies, so rarely do you see any soldier's testimony. And there were probably reasons for this. So like I said, Koreans moved out. Testimonies were collected in Hiroshima proper. Soldiers were not from Hiroshima, but there's also a lot of soldiers that were in Hiroshima. It was headquarters of the Second Japanese Army. Hiroshima Castle was right there. It was a big military center. A lot of the soldiers actually moved to Iwate. There's a lot of soldiers from Tohoku, and they got exposed again in 311. And both in the first time and the second time, no one talked about it.
Kyle, you muted.
Thank you. Aaron, you've written about how awareness of empire may help us understand the brutality of war. Could you speak to that issue?
Sure. I was hoping we would front load Sayaka to respond to that, but
Or maybe you could reframe my question to her then.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to weigh in on it. I mean, I think it's sort of getting at why people in Britain and Japan were so committed to fighting this conflict, and why so many people came to see it as an existential conflict, right? That if victory isn't achieved, then the nation will be destroyed. These sorts of narratives, where do they come from? And I think as a social historian who's read a lot of for lack, I don't know how best to put it, life writing, ego documents, diaries, memoirs, these sorts of things. The notion that the Second World War was an existential conflict of mutual annihilation is a pretty strong and transnationally shared assumption even among Americans who are shipping off the Guadalcanal. You know, they're writing, if we don't win this war, the Japanese will take California kind of attitude. So it's a very, to me, it's very curious. I mean, in retrospect, we probably don't think it is surprising because we know the whole history of the Holocaust and atomic bombings and Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe and so on. It maybe in retrospect we should, or it doesn't seem that surprising. But if you kind of ground that assumption within, you know, what had been happening previously, it seems to have been part of a general heating up of discussions, whether it's Britain, Japan, China, the Soviet Union, that, you know, this is the war to end all wars, and not in that it leads to a lasting peace, but that a failure of self-defense results in annihilation, which means that, you know, anything goes. And it kind of goes to some of the questions I think that Mark Caprio has been asking in the comments as well. How do civilians become legitimate targets? Well, if you think, you know, failure to defend your nation is going to result in annihilation, then you would be potentially willing to take a number of different tactics in order to achieve victory. And it's so if we kind of, I think one of the things that becomes a little clearer when we put empire back into the frame and the longer history of conflicts leading up to the Second World War, we can see that it's a kind of gradual ratcheting up of stakes as things go on. So in the Japanese case, for example, the military is perpetually looking at the Soviet Union as an existential threat. There is obviously a war in China from 1937 that doesn't seem to ever end. And, you know, as a consequence of this war in China, almost straight away in 1937, both the Chinese nationalist government and the Japanese government are not particularly willing to negotiate with each other. So these are not only wars in which you have kind of a total mobilization of people across empires in order to sort of save Japan from you know, what people like Ishiwara Kanji would have considered a race war of annihilation, but also one in which negotiation is no longer possible. So it's a kind of transformation in the way that people talk about war when you can contrast it, for example, with wars of the 19th century, where people say, well, you know, once the armies have defeated each other in a field of battle, then we go into negotiation and we can figure out, you know, who owns Alsace-Lorraine or whatever. Then, you know, in this kind of conflict where civilians are being pulled into it, and the longer history of imperial expansion, which is almost always construed as some kind of self-defense strategy, it becomes impossible to negotiate your way or talk your way out of these conflicts. And then you start to see the creeping rhetoric that, the other in the conflict is one that really needs to be nearly annihilated in order to achieve security. So that's why one of the reasons why I think empire is really important to keep in the frame, because it also extends the timeline chronologically, prior to 1941 and 1937, and so we can get a sense of what people thought the stakes were going into the war. But I think Sayaka probably has a more perceptive take on this and the role of empire and how it strengthens our knowledge of the history of the war.
Well, I think I don't have any more informative information, useful information than Aaron just provided. It's just a very complicated. It's a very thorough. It requires a thorough analysis of how imperialism worked in the interwar period, which was obviously changing in nature. So Eric Hobsbawm divided the 20th century before and after World War I, and before World War I, he called it the age of empire, and after that is age of extremes. But if you were looking at the Asian theater, it just overlaps from the interwar period into the later 20th century, and actually the experience of imperialism never really ended until decolonization starts in Southeast Asia. And even then, because of the Cold War situation, experience of being colonized continued through the Cold War. So this overlap has to be admitted instead of just transition from one period to the other. That's first thing that I have to say. Also, there's so many questions that I was reading about in this chat box. There's one about, sorry for just jumping into
That's fine.
questions, and I didn't address the Japanese aggression that caused that invited the mentality of savior mentality on the side of Americans. So obviously we need to address the fact that Japanese were killing tons of people and raping people in China, Southeast Asia, and brutalizing Korean people, Taiwanese people as well. So that fact is should not be forgotten, obviously, just because Japan received the atomic bomb. And this is something that we kind of have to accept as a baseline when we discuss the wartime sort of victimhood of Japanese homeland. So I just want to say it here.
Oh, great. Aaron, you had made the point that in the memoirs of the war, a lot of the work by Japanese focused on victimology, whereas in Britain, there's a focus on heroism. Could you talk about the distinction between, the Asian theater and the European theater and the different tropes that were used to talk about the motivations and implications of the bombing campaigns?
Yeah, it's something that appears in the review that Ron and I wrote of Malcolm Gladwell's book as well, and that and it reminded me of some reflections that U.S. servicemen had during the war, particularly towards the end of the war, when soldiers were sent home from a tour of duty or otherwise demobilized, and then particularly after the war, when the soldiers largely came home, which is a lack of desire among particularly the victorious allies to talk about victimization. So if you read the most of the literature on the Blitz, as it's generally referred to in Britain, the bombing campaign over Britain, a lot of it has to do with the resilience of cities, how people pulled together and achieved unity, how they were able to, as the Japanese would say, hoshigaranai katsumade wa, like putting away things that are, one's desires and wants until the war has been won. So sacrificing, particularly material comfort. And so, you know, I've just had very interesting reactions, even today when presenting to mixed audiences, particularly those who were raised within the culture of Blitz remembrance in Britain. The reaction typically is, well, why are you focusing on people being victimized by the bombing campaigns in Britain? And often it comes out in other ways as well, where people will say, well, but you know, the Japanese had a much harder experience with the bombing than people in Britain did. And I said, well, that's kind of irrelevant if you're in a city in Britain that's being bombed. Like, you're not going to say, oh, well, at least I'm not in Japan. You know, if your house is being blown up, no one really has that reaction. So what we see then are two sort of slightly different framings, right? One being, because Japan also had this experience of resilience, right? People say, well, people in Britain were very resilient and they, you know, stuck to the war effort. I say, well, people in Japan did that too. You know, they were rebuilding their cities, and when the bombs were falling, they were, you know, the Kokubo Fujinkai and these sorts of groups were organizing and helping soldiers. Women's associations and youth groups were pulling down unsafe houses and trying to get people fed. It's not as though one country had one experience and one had the other. We can talk about degrees, but I am curious about, I mean, the facile explanation, for example, is that, well, Britain was on the victorious side, therefore they want to emphasize heroism, and Japan was on the losing side, therefore they want to emphasize victimization. I'm not so sure I'm always convinced by that. And I think some of the more interesting examples are when we look at countries like the Soviet Union, which was, you know, done terribly by the war, but then also was on the victorious side, and the ways in which sort of victimization and heroism kind of collide within the memory culture in the Soviet Union. But I am overall interested in why these narratives emerge the way they do. And I have a kind of instinctual, I can't quite articulate it yet, but I have a slight dislike for the idea that narratives of victimization of civilians in Japan are a byproduct of wanting the country, or as a kind of, if you like, subconscious desire to argue back against the evil or malicious nature of the Japanese Empire, to find a victim position for themselves in the post-war period. It may simply be the fact that because their wartime government was so utterly discredited, it opens a space for people to talk about themselves as having a difficult time during the war and how horrible war is, and create a kind of culture of pacifism. Whereas in Britain, were you to launch that sort of discussion, you would inevitably bump up against people saying, why are you speaking in such a negative way about the war, you know, when it was such a great time for our military and we achieved great victories and we all pulled together? Much the same way that when you see US soldiers coming back from the Pacific Theater talking about how terrible the experience was, for example, fighting Guadalcanal, they're told by a lot of other soldiers, don't talk about things that way, you're neurotic. Don't bring up suffering. You know, they want things to stay positive, in part because of the war effort, but also to ramp up these victories. I'm rambling on a bit here, but there's another side to this, which is to look at the Chinese nationalists who have a great difficulty balancing politically useful narratives about the victimization of civilians and the sort of brutality of the Japanese army on the one hand, with the desire to portray Chinese soldiers valiantly sacrificing themselves against the Japanese Empire on the other. So the heroism and the victimization both serve equally important purposes in terms of national mobilization, and they never quite reconcile that during the war years. And it, depending on which scholar you read, they have in the Chinese history field, they have totally different takes on it. You know, some scholars say no, it was all about heroism, and others say no, it was all about victimization. And that just kind of shows us kind of the difficulty of talking about these issues. But I am interested in the generation of these narratives. Where do they come from? Why are people picking them up? Why are they embracing them? And I guess my sort of off the cuff feeling at the moment is that one of the reasons why it takes off in Japan is it's much easier to talk about it in the post-war period than it would have been in Britain, even though it doesn't take that much digging to find those narratives in Britain, right? I mean, I'm not a deeply skilled British historian, but I went to, 5 or 6 local history centers and the kind of local history section where people self-publish things. And there it is. There are the victim narratives. There are people talking about how horrible the war is. Never want to do it again. I'm a pacifist now. So maybe it's a question of what is being elevated at the level of kind of social discourse, what people are talking about publicly, versus, what you find when you're kind of sniffing around dusty books in the local history section.
Aaron, in the national museums, are those kind of narratives put forward? I'm thinking in particular, Yasukuni Shinja, and at Yushikan Yasukuni, they really do have a kind of victim narrative from the very beginning. I think, I don't know if they still have it, but they had a calligraphy scroll by the Emperor Meiji at the entrance that said, "When I look upon the foreign horizon and I see the black ships, I worry about the future of my country." And then, you know, it's kind of a death shrine, but the messaging, and it's very well, you know, the stagecraft is very well done with translations. It really does portray this narrative that Japan was pulled or pushed into the war. I was with a group of study abroad students outside the museum, and these older Japanese guys were selling kamikaze t-shirts and bandanas. And I asked one of them if he could speak just for a moment to the American study abroad students. And he said, "We always said Japan entered the war because A, B, C, D." And he said, "The Americans, the British, the Chinese." And then he paused and he said, "Taro," he's yelling across the thing. "D wa dare desu ka?" He said, "Dutch." "Oh, so the Dutch," right? So, I mean, that's portrayed actually in that museum, which is very different than like the Jewish History Museum in both in Israel, but also the German Museum, which is that in Dresden or Berlin, I think. You know, the way, yeah. Maybe Ron, you know more about that than I do. Maybe you could speak to that.
Well, Holocaust memorialization is very different because the Jews were not part of the war. They're on the side of the war. They never attacked or participated as a political actor in the war, which was, so it is much more of a pure, straightforward victimization narrative. But in the beginning of the history of commemoration in Israel, there was this idea of wanting to have a heroic, just like the Allies did. There were a couple of Jewish soldiers, but a small number. There were the partisans, and those were emphasized as heroic. So the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, for example, will get this oversized place in Israeli education because they did not go as lambs to the slaughter. I don't know how Korean memory of this, but I suspect it will be kind of similar, like in wanting to talk more about resistance than rather than talk about being victimization. But there is kind of this strange, also in Japanese right wings and a lot of nationalist discourse. There's this strange kind of tension between being victims all the time, because conservatives are always victims. They're always the true victims. There's this book, Alison, I forgot, The Cult of True Victimhood. I forgot the name of the author, Alison Cole, I think the name is. And she talks about right wing in America and how right wingers always say that they are the true victims. They're always the victims. They can be in power for 40 years, control all the levels of power, but they're still the victims. And this is what happened with Japanese victimization. You know, they rampage all over Asia, but they're the victims of the West, right? Israel as well. They will always be the victims, even though they have nuclear bombs and they control millions of Palestinians, but they're the victims. So there's a strange kind of tension. But I want to go back. I think there's a chronology here. I want to go back to the heroism issue that Aaron brought up, because I mentioned, so when I mentioned Israel about the heroism narratives, this completely obscured any talk about suffering, any talk about long-term suffering. I don't want to use the word trauma because I'm allergic to it, but no one used it at the time. It didn't exist at the time, but there's complete erasure of any kind of long-term suffering because they wanted to talk about the heroism. And people are ashamed to talk about their victimization because they didn't raise up and took arms against the Nazis. And you have kind of a similar thing happening, I think, in the UK, in the US with soldiers, in China, in communist and nationalist China, when you can't talk about Nanjing for years and years and years because the communists don't want to, and Aaron knows much more about it than me, but the communists don't want to talk about Nanjing up until the 80s, at least. Nanjing Memorial was built when, 84, 85, right? So this heroic narrative does real damage to, even in the clinical sense of not recognizing long-term mental damage. And it's the same in Hiroshima, but in a twist that the Hibakusha are seeing as those heroic figures that move from drifting to resistance. There is this Japanese sociologist called Ishida Tadashi, who talks about, is very influential in portraying the Hibakusha as moving from being suffering drifters into being resistors, into resisting and struggling against the bomb. And those who make the transition into heroes of the movement don't have mental suffering. They overcame their suffering. So this is kind of, even though they put the survivors in the center, they still manage to have their heroic narrative. This is left-wing heroism. But in here as well, it kind of doesn't talk about just regular people. And I think that's what everybody forgets. It's regular people who get their house blown up and they just want to go back to their life. Everybody have a stake in the story, and no one talks about the regular people who just have their house, their life blown to smithereens. Sorry, I just kind of started rumbling, but.
Well, I think maybe we might be able to open this up to the more general audience. So everyone, if you don't mind, maybe you could turn your cameras on now and keep your audio muted until you're called on. And I'm just going to go through some of the chat room questions. Mark Caprio, would you mind raising a question? You had a couple of interesting questions there.
Oh, well, this is good because I just got back from Hiroshima myself, and I was reading Sayaka's article on the Koreans in Japan. So this sort of ties together. But I teach a class on war where I have about 20 years. And the question is how war has changed over the years from traditional war, I guess you could say, to total war, and who are the victims? And so, or the warriors, I guess you might say. And it seems that because of total war, when you have people coming to the factories to work, how do you rank these people? Are they civilians still, or are they targets, eligible targets for destruction because they're helping the war cause? And it's a question I raised in my class and haven't gotten a decent answer. I think there's sort of a gray area there, but I'd like to hear your comments on this.
Or
anybody who feels they're.
I think Aaron is probably the best person to answer that question, but my own feeling is that that's exactly what the core issue is here when it comes to thinking about air bombing, not just atomic bombs, because total mobilization means everyone is has to be contributing to war effort.
Right.
But in factory, there were women and children and Koreans and Taiwanese, and they are there not out of their own volition, but they are still the cog of the war machine. So I think that's exactly what we are facing. And morally speaking, I have my moral response. It's wrong to bomb them. But strategically speaking or legally speaking, people might have a different reaction to this, right?
No, I'm in agreement. I don't like bombing at all. I'm against that.
Right.
But I'm just saying, how do you just war thinking has made it very clear in saying you make a distinction between civilians and military. And it seems to be a very difficult thing to do nowadays. I mean, just war thinking goes back to the BCE times. And so
Absolutely.
it's a little different than they're talking about using chariots in wars. That's okay, but things have changed, obviously.
I have a related question to put to all the panelists. The work, of course, of A.C. Grayling, Among the Dead Cities, where he talks about the moral, philosophical debates about saturation or carpet bombing, starting in the European theater and then going through into the bombing of some 67 Japanese cities, concluded by the bombings, the attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I'm interested in how do you address these issues when you're talking to students? Because even Grayling himself, who's very erudite and philosophically sophisticated about these issues, when he talks about it, he ends up almost working both ends against the middle. Of course, no one is going to be in favor of, carpet bombing or the killing of civilians. But that ruthless logic seems to be a place that a lot of people, particularly conservatives, settle on. And how do you deal with the complications of that debate? I mean, very quickly, if you talk to a group of American citizens about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they'll say, well, it shortened the war. It ultimately might have saved millions of people's lives in the grand scheme of things. How do you address that debate? Or more broadly, how have scholars address that debate?
I think if I can start, among scholars, I mean, no one really takes seriously the whole idea that the bomb shortened the war. What shortened the war was the Soviets' invasion, basically. And I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, what shortened the war or not, but this was ex post facto justification. And he talks about invasion and shortened the war. And the end of the day, even if this killing innocent civilians, targeting innocent civilians is wrong, period. Carpet bombing is wrong, period. And what Malcolm, and I think this is a good point, a good time to bring up Malcolm Gladwell, because all of his book is about reviving this 50s nostalgia into like the good US Air Force, the good LeMay, our brutal yet honest guy who's from, I don't know, was it from Tennessee or wherever he was?
No, he's from my home state of Ohio, I think.
Ohio. It's trying to deflect there. But we have to resist this myth, this because there is no justification for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, justification for Chongqing, Nanjing, nothing, zero. I don't think we can. I don't think we need to go there. There's no room for debate, and that's why the big problem I have with Grayling there, because it's talking on the field, taking using the. There's not even a question that it needed to discuss, I guess.
I mean, there's obviously a kind of going back to Mark Caprio's point. I suppose, okay, so it depends on who you ask among historians whether the bombing campaign ends the war or not. And there's a certain amount of uncertainty at the moment, and perhaps some scholars wanting to be a little bit provocative and revisionist by revisiting this issue and saying, oh, but look at the impact it actually had. But I like Ron, and I suspect Sayaka as well, we look at this intervention of the Soviet Union as being a really decisive factor. And like Ron, I don't really want to get into that debate too much. We can, but I would prefer not. But I think what I would point out, I have a general frustration, first of all, with good scholars who really do deep dives into, for example, the conversations that are had among the teams in strategic bombing in the U.S. Air Force, or not the U.S. Air Force, the armed forces, the United States at that time, it's not an independent Air Force, who are discussing about how to force Japan to capitulate, because it kind of becomes a sort of a Yabunonaka, kind of like you get lost in the thicket of, he said, she said, and then you can question about how sincere people are when they say things, particularly when you get to people like LeMay. It's not always clear where he stands, and even something that he said and has been documented to say, it's not always clear to me like how believable these statements are. So if he says, well, I'm only, so for example, if you say, well, Curtis LeMay on such and such a date said, we're only going to hit military targets, we're not going to actually hit civilians. But then they go and design a bombing campaign that absolutely razes an entire working class district of a Japanese city. You say, well, I don't believe him. I simply don't believe it. So, and LeMay is infamously terse. He also understood his sort of historic role, much like Truman did. So he knows that everything is documented that he says goes into the record. So there's a certain amount of, I think, over expenditure of energy on figuring out what people's motivations are in these sort of highest level, let's say the commanding heights of strategy. If we kind of apply some common sense and actually look at some of the other comments people make at the time, which is, we have to dehouse the workers, or we have to, destroy the systems that produce the war machine. Well, of course, part of the systems that produce the war machine are the workers. And if you're kind of looking at the ways in which certain neighborhoods are targeted in Germany or Japan or in Britain, it's pretty clear that these are bombing campaigns that are not meant to, simply destroy machines, but also, kill the people like lathe operators who are really important for industrial production. And sometimes people become honest and they say, well, this is what we're doing. And in other cases say, we don't care if people die, or that's incidental. In other cases, they say, and I think this is kind of where Gladwell gets a little bit snookered, by the sources, where people are saying, well, we didn't really want to kill anyone. We just wanted to burn their cities to the ground, which is a completely disingenuous comment, and he just kind of takes them at face value because he's so enamored of these guys and the sort of technical feats they pulled off during the war years. So I think it's kind of, in a sense, we can apply our common sense and say, well, if destroying the country's capacity to fight is the objective of the war, and if the bombing campaigns are targeting civilian areas, then the mass killing of civilians was part of the strategy, right? And so I think that just should be obvious. But then, of course, someone will come up and say, well, look, I found, Curtis LeMay saying X, Y, and Z at a certain date, and that sort of disproves what you've just argued. And I said, yeah, but that wasn't the outcome. That wasn't where we landed with this strategy. So I guess I don't care, what he said on such and such a date. So, I mean, kind of going to your bigger point, though, how did this happen? And it simply, I guess, from my perspective, it is national governments are unwilling to negotiate to end these conflicts. At which point, the scope of what becomes a legitimate target expands, and the nature of modern warfare is active participation and support of the civilian population is integral to prosecuting the war effort. So the more the people throw themselves into this war effort, the more they make themselves targets of the enemy action. And so we can have a kind of productive discussion then about, to what extent people who are actively supporting the war effort are actually responsible, for bringing the violence to themselves. But that's also another thicket that maybe we don't want to get into today.
You all know the documentary film, The Fog of War, Errol Morris interviewing Robert McNamara towards the end of his life. And in that film, there's about maybe a 15-minute section on the firebombing of the Japanese cities. And McNamara says that if the United States would have lost the war, they all would have been treated like war criminals. And he quotes Curtis LeMay. There was a panel discussion after that film came out that UC Berkeley has. It's up on YouTube. And it's the documentary filmmaker Errol Morris and Robert McNamara. And I don't know, a third of the way into it or so, McNamara quotes a direct conversation that he had with LeMay, where LeMay said the dropping of the atomic bombs was not necessary to end the war, and that he was quite aware of that. But as you just mentioned, I mean, LeMay in some ways is not a very complicated figure. Kind of what you see is what you get. But he certainly had no sentimentality about these issues. You may know the work of Kai Erikson. It has a book called A New Species of Trouble. And in that, he has a chapter on the bombings of Hiroshima, and he makes an interesting argument that there never really was a very complicated debate at the highest levels of government about the use of the atomic bomb. He says that it was an organizational inertia that once it got underway, it just, by its own logic and the amount of resources that have been invested in creating the bomb, that it was going to happen, and no one really questioned it seriously about it happening. So I wonder how much of this discussion is after the fact, retrospectively, where people are going back. I really felt that in McNamara's case, these were crocodile tears. Where was he, both in the Pacific War, the Korean War, dropping napalm in Vietnam. He certainly had decades of his life, committed to that, those kind of campaigns.
I want to just, if you talk about Vietnam, I want to give Sayaka time to reply also, but I just want to mention all of this thinking going on, right? All this thinking, we took Vietnam. So Layton, that I mentioned before, he worked on Agent Orange in Vietnam, right? This whole, the whole idea behind, mutual destruction, this same thinking that goes on in destroying civilians in World War II. And in a way, this demystifying the bomb, which is, by the way, a title of Shigesawa Atsuko dissertation. It's not my phrase. Shigesawa Atsuko in Kobe University. it worked, right? Because the mutual assured destruction, the whole idea behind the legitimacy of destroying whole cities, right, came from this thinking of the air war, right? And now we don't really think about it so much, but the world was hanging by a thread for so many years because of that. But yes, so I want to go back to Sakuna.
I would add the Korean War to it too. During the Korean War, there were more bombs. The number of bombs dropped over the Korean Peninsula than the Pacific theater of World War II, all combined. So yes, so it was a bombing war, and that became, it seems like between 1945 and 1950, that became the norm of how to fight a war. So that continued into Vietnam War, as you said. I was thinking, so I grew up in Japan, and I kind of absorbed this pacifist discourse, education policy through my life until I left Japan. And it was certainly a soft button, very sensitive button to press in myself when I started studying in the US, and people just casually talk about, what do you think about atomic bombs? And what do you think about the second bomb? And like, it's not about a strategic importance that we're dealing with, from someone who were exposed to this pacifist discourse in particular. And it's not, so focusing on the hypothetical of not dropping or just one in Hiroshima, or it's just really bothered me. And I got used to it afterwards. But hearing all this discussion, I just remember that vividly. And also, it's all the pop culture that in the 1970s, 80s that almost mocked and made it casual to use the A-bomb, the cloud, as a sort of cultural symbol or pop culture symbol. And that was also quite out of touch of what actually happened in Asia. And I'm talking about this because it's very difficult for as a Japanese historian, to settle the issue of the Nanjing massacre. But we do have this responsibility and comfort women and all this historical baggage that historians of Japan have to engage in. At the same time, I just don't see a lot of commitment from American historians or historians of the US doing the same thing about the atomic bombs or napalm bombing or Korean War. So that is another thing that bothers me as a citizen, not as a historian necessarily. So I love to hear what you feel as, I'm sure many of you are historians teaching in the United States or in Asia. So I love to hear.
I think that's a really good point. And there's also, I mean, this sort of memory culture, which is often overlaps with pacifism, and there's also this kind of, how can I put it, subtle division between, Heiwa Kyoiku and Hansen Kyoiku that people kind of debate in Japan as well. The Meg Nakano in the chat brought up a really good point, that, for a lot of people in Japan, and I've noticed this kind of reading the social history documents, they really did sort of see themselves as fighting against white supremacy, if you like, to put it in common parlance, across Asia. And that feeds a lot of the sort of existential war beliefs that people had going into the war. And then as soon as the bombing campaign is concluded and there's peace, the empire disappears, and it becomes, why did this happen to us? Why were we targeted? And it kind of also goes to, I know what some things that Ron is struggling with or working on at the moment, which is the memory of Hiroshima. where if you, and one of the other comments, asking us to evaluate films on Hiroshima, and I think it's in Kuroyame, there's a scene where in Black Rain, where one of the victims wakes up and he said, why did they choose us? Why did they drop the bomb on Hiroshima? Like, we were just kind of innocent people going about our daily business. And that could have been true for him. But of course, Hiroshima and its port are kind of flowing soldiers out into the China theater. If you read soldiers' diaries from the period, they talk about Hiroshima as this, the military city full of soldiers constantly. Now, I'm not therefore justifying the bombing of Hiroshima, but what I am saying is that there are these interesting ruptures in memory that occur at each stage where empire is either erased or the kind of militarization of Japanese society is erased to kind of create a subject that can stand in as a victim. And as to why American historians aren't doing this kind of work, I would also ask it kind of the British historians as well. Why do you keep going back to resilience and unity? I don't get it, because when and it sort of also goes back to what we were discussing previously about kind of peace museum or about museum culture, and Kyle brought up Yasukuni, which of course is an important space for crafting Japanese memory. But in the course of writing my first book in particular, I went to about 30 or 40 different war and peace museums across Japan, including self-defense force ones and peace museums. And a lot of these peace museums in particular are fairly marginalized when we talk about post-war memory, especially the regional ones. So there was one in Saitama, there's obviously the really impressive one at Itsumeikan, the Peace Osaka, which occasionally gets in the news. But then there are all these sort of little ones around as well. Shizuoka has one, sometimes it's a room, sometimes it's in just a big space in a shiakusho or something. But it's always curious to me that we kind of strive for this sort of unified memory of Japan's war experience when it's really quite divided. Right, it's divided by gender, by class, whether you had active servicemen in your family, but also, these are sort of categories that we're very comfortable with, I think, as historians talk about gender, class, race, ethnicity, empire, but it's really divided by region as well. So people in Tohoku are having a really different experience of the war than people are in Kanto, if you're living in Kawasaki and just getting bombed every day. People in Aomori didn't see anything happen until like right at the end of the war. And that's kind of their dominant memory of it, the city being wiped out right at the end of the war. So I think there's a kind of, and once you sort of disaggregate these divisions, and I would also just say that you see a similar sort of issue with the British memory, that everything's London, London, London all the time, even though London is completely unrepresentative of what the rest of the country is going through at the time. And then people who are doing this sort of more localized histories, whether it's the Northwest with Liverpool and Merseyside, or up even in Scotland or Northern Ireland. They're kind of treated as if they're local historians, right? You're doing kind of like Chihoshi or something, and they're kind of like, well, for these provincials doing that work, that's interesting, but the history of the war is really about the London Blitz, which is complete nonsense. So it's, and I think once you're able to break down these divisions, whether it's class, gender, region, race, whatever, you actually start to see these really important commonalities between those divisions, like the way that women in Britain and women in Japan are experiencing the war has a lot more in common than you might expect. And that I think is important because it helps us get around these sort of thornier issues like, well, how are we going to describe Japanese memory of the war? Well, there isn't really a Japanese memory of the war. There's a kind of deeply divided memory of the war across Japan. And some of the reportage, I have to say, really, really bothers me and gets under my skin, because they always go to Yasukuni and then they go to Hiroshima maybe. And then the rest of the war has just disappeared. It's gone. And this is, particularly why I like Ron's work and Sayaka's work, because it helps us kind of break those down a bit more and see the empire and see the region. Sorry, I've rambled on a bit there, but hopefully I've drawn some of the comments in the comments section as well.
Thank you very much. Andrew Horvath, you had a question for Sayaka.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Sayaka, I enjoyed very much your description of the empire, because I think you focused on something which it tends to be forgotten, and that is that in fact the colonial subjects, especially youth, were very energized and saw themselves as quite, how can I put it, loyal subjects of the empire, even though, and in fact, I think you mentioned that they sought to emulate Japanese participation and there, in fact, we know, I think there have been a number of young Korean kamikaze pilots as well, and volunteers, and in fact, I think the former Korean president Park Chung-hee himself was a volunteer who got into the Manchukuo army. Now, this aspect of war memory has been transformed or transmogrified or cleverly supplanted conveniently with a mythology of active resistance against Japan. Very much as in the way that Ron has mentioned about Israel, the exaggeration of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Have you, in your research, seen any kind of a change towards the acceptance of this very sad reality of Korean colonial experience? This idea that, well, yes, we once were loyal subjects. This is something we have to deal with, and then move on and build a realistic vision of our past.
Well, thank you very much for your question. It's, as long as I can see in the popular media, the popular description of Japanese rule of Korea hasn't changed much. There is a lot more emphasis on, again, resistance and victimization in the form of comfort women. And so that really dominates the public memory of Japanese colonialism. That said, if you look at historiography, historians' works coming from Korea, I think there are a lot more diverse voices now, at least among professional historians. And what I see in movie industry as well, there are a number of fictional films that go beyond the victimizer and victim sort of dichotomy, and they kind of try to sort of show a different story, a different life story that's not so clear cut, and to some extent some nostalgia about the pre-war period as well, or colonial soul, for example. So I think there are some seeds of diverse experiences, not necessarily in terms of wartime mobilized enthusiasm for the war effort, but as an experience of colonial modernity or women's liberation, for example.
I think that's a great comment from Sayaka. I have a book chapter. I'm not too proud of it, but it's there anyway. You can read it if you want to see me falling down on the job a bit. But it's on peace museums in Japan, and one of the things that I argue in that is what usually stymies people who walk into the discussion about war memory in Japan is they want there to be a museum, one museum they can go to, right, and get the full picture. And I think this kind of comes, I'm not saying Joe Anderson's doing this, but I can see her come. Has anyone ever thought of creating museums that pair, different winner and loser perspectives on the same conflict? That'd be brilliant. The Imperial War Museum in London occasionally does some interesting things where they'll have, special exhibits on people who were part of the empire and their experience. But the thing is, what is our national museum in Japan, right? What is the representative museum? It's the central government has that kind of peace and reconciliation room that they launched in the Sumitomo Biru. I actually don't know if it's still there or not, but that was sort of kind of connected to the government's efforts regarding onkyu, or these sort of payments out to victims of the war and veterans. But it is a kind of heavily weighted on the victim side. I guess the thing that I find interesting about Japan, I wouldn't go so far as to say, oh, this is something I really like, but I find it very interesting, is that it's very pluralistic. And this is sort of, the point that I try to make in the book chapter, that if you amble around a lot of places in Japan, particularly regional museums or, things that are connected to the teachers union or any of these other sort of organizations in Japan, you can see just how mixed the memory is. And it includes things that Sayaka's mentioning, things about empire. I remember someone saying to me, Japanese people don't remember the people they victimized in the empire. And I said, well, but Peace Osaka had a whole exhibit, on this for years and years and years. I know it met a lot of resistance to the Osaka mayor, but they were there. Nitsume-kan does this stuff all the time. It's there if you look for it, but there isn't a museum, right? There isn't like the place you can go in Tokyo that encapsulates, and maybe that's an advantage. Maybe that can be a good thing. But I've often said to friends and colleagues, Tokyo sometimes feels like a war memory dead zone. You walk in there and there just doesn't seem to be anything there. It's the government abdicates any responsibility for presenting the history of the war. And they kind of, delegate it or devolve it, if you like, to non-government organizations to do it. Whether that's good or bad, I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. But there certainly are these spaces out there in Japan. I don't know if Sayaka and Ron have been to many of these like tiny little local museums. There's one in Kochi that's really interesting called Kuseno-ie, and but it was a huge part of the peace movement, throughout the post-war period. And I don't know why we talk about this less and less as time goes on.
Yeah, Sherzo Muminov mentioned the name of a museum in Sumitomo. I haven't been there, but I've been many others. But one of the things I do is trek to a lot of Holocaust museums in Japan. There are many. Because of the way that the Japanese government allocate funds, a lot of it goes to small cities that a lot of them sometimes find some kind of, in order like machitsukuri, like regional revival that ends up in those museums. And so a lot of them end up being museums like this. And, the fact that the state obligates responsibility, like Francisca Serafim said it already in the 90s, she showed very well how the state takes as little as possible in commemoration because it's so complicated, right?
So when I was in college, I went to Sofia. I was volunteering for this small NGO that organizes exhibition about Holocaust for children. And there was a symposium where so elementary school children are organizing and coordinating the speeches and the films and stuff about the Holocaust. And it was in a small hall, but when we were having it and it was kind of helping as staff, there was this old man, Japanese man, who stood up from the audience during the Q&A. He started to confess about his experience as a doctor in Unit 731. And then it was very like, what's going on moment. And up until then, children thought this atrocity was about somewhere else. And then this man suddenly started to talk about Japanese atrocity. And then I just remembered that it was like an incredible moment of shock for everyone.
Yeah, it's like I'll interview you about this later on. It's great because there's one thing that I just had an event about a Holocaust in East Asia, and one place that I work with, or I hope to work with, I can never go there because now you can never travel. They invite me. There's a museum in Taiwan that do like Anne Frank and Amma. Amma is comfort women, and they pair Anne Frank with comfort women because they're both young women and they're victims. Japanese think about Anne Frank is completely something different. It's like every time you go to any shop, you have like the Anne Frank manga, like a manga book, and they completely disassociate Anne from like being anything but a young girl and a victim of the Nazis. They never really think about the young girls they victimized. It doesn't really click.
Right.
Never really click, right? That you're the Nazis in this story, right? It never really clicks. It's kind of amazing how much cognitive dissonance it is for Japanese to think about specifically the Holocaust.
Yeah.
Now, Ron, I know you're a little bit reluctant to go into a lot of detail on this, even though you wrote a superb essay with Aaron on the issue. Can we loop back to Malcolm Gladwell's book and the conversation that has provoked? Because, say what you will, it's well done as a piece of writing and theater, his audiobook, he's a bestseller. there are many people who are now have become aware of these issues that certainly would not have been aware of them before. And I thought your critique was especially insightful. I had listened to, I think he had 4 or 5 conjoined episodes in his podcast called Revisionist History, where, you know, it works up to the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th. And, you know, I thought it was, in some ways, is very well done, but I couldn't quite put words to it. I couldn't frame why it was unsettling until I read your essay. And it really, I thought it was very well done. So maybe without using this as an occasion to beat Malcolm Gladwell up against the head necessarily, could we talk more broadly about the kind of argument that he makes and what your and Aaron's response to that is?
Well, the book is not well done. The podcast is well done. He wrote the book as an audio book, basically, and it shows. If you read the book, is really, you know, like, as someone who writes for a living, as a lot of us do, you're squirming like, how could it get published, right? It's very colloquial, and it's very, it's like it's written for someone to talk, but like what really got to us, I guess, is first the lack of voices of victims. It's all made, as we said, from telephones, but it's all very American. And Gladwell was not American, but he's very American telling of the story. And it's very Silicon Valley-ish in a way that he's obsessed with technology. And it's like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg in a bomber. That's
very well done.
It's like, it's very
played.
kind of like very fascinated by inventors and like the technology, and they forget what technology does, right? He has this whole chapter about napalm and how great those crazy inventors are. It's napalm. It's stuff that kills people horribly, right? And that's what really got me. It's not something to celebrate, and he celebrates in a very well-produced way, but he celebrates.
Yeah, he seems enthralled with LeMay, of all people. You know, he's just like, look at this guy. How can you not like this guy? And then by the end of it, he's reversed himself. But, you know, on YouTube, they have these master classes with these various authorities. And in the promotional trailer for his master class, he says the key to really good popular writing is to take really brilliant ideas and write them at a 6th grade level. And I think that's what you're talking about in terms of it being, as an audiobook, it's a little bit more persuasive than it is certainly as a piece of scholarly writing. And it is quite conservative in some ways, and I mean politically conservative.
It's very, he's enamored with the US Air Force. And I know, as someone who spent too many years in the Army, like there's nothing to be romantic about. There's something that I really don't understand about. I mean, I lived in America for most of my adult life, and I really don't understand this idealization of the Army and Army service and the troops and this fascination with war machines. But I mean, there's reason for it. There's this piece in the BBC a couple of weeks ago, maybe it was Guardian, about how the Pentagon spent control so much of the film industry and how much we were brainwashed. If you watch popular movies anywhere in the world, you will get so much military propaganda, right? And Aaron can talk much more about it because he grew up with this, but Gladwell was like this. He's enamored with technology and military technology.
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear, you know, to tie these conversations slightly into our kind of personal lives. I mean, hearing about Sayaka's experiences and Ron's, and you know, I of the 3 of us, I'm the only one who grew up in the United States, and I grew up very close to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So, you know, I was accustomed to this sort of techno nationalism, you know, that Gladwell is somewhat indulging in that book, and certainly built models of, you know, SR-71 Blackbirds and the Warthogs, the tank killers, and all that stuff. So I was kind of really immersed within. I knew people who worked in GE building, you know, components for fighter jet engines and things like that. So it was all kind of part of the environment I grew up in. But I think unlike the distinction I would draw between myself and Gladwell is that he kind of embraced this techno nationalism, and I really learned to strongly dislike it. And probably the principle, I said this a lot to Ron in the past, probably the real trigger to that was when I was about 14 years old and went to high school. You know, we were told by our teachers, we don't do kind of these sort of air raid drills anymore, you know, duck and cover, go and so on and so forth. And I said, well, why don't we do that anymore? And he went into an explanation. He said, well, one of the main reasons is, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is. So one of the main reasons is that if we're ever involved in a thermonuclear war with the Soviet Union, you can't run. Southern Ohio being part of this sort of military infrastructure, you're going to be vaporized. There's no escape. So we don't bother anymore with these sort of defensive activities. Once the war starts, you're dead. You'll have maybe 10 minutes once you know it's coming. And at that point, I stopped building the models. It just wasn't fun anymore. But I just don't think Gladwell and I are in the same headspace. Let's put it that way in terms of international conflict.
Aaron, could you unpackage just for a moment what you mentioned about techno nationalism and what that implies?
Sure. It's the idea that people take pleasure, or perhaps even a sense of membership in the nation by celebrating its technological achievements, particularly in the area of military technology. And this is something that I think from Japanese history we know a little bit about, particularly when the Japanese Navy started building its own dreadnoughts, and launching them at the beginning of the 20th century. There are always these huge public celebrations of this because it showed a mastery of technology, which in a sense gave people a sense of power and sovereignty, an ability to defend their country against foreign intruders. But then, as Sayaka knows, this gets tangled up with empire, and the line of self-defense is ever growing, and it never stops, and it keeps sucking more and more people into it until inevitably you get drawn into a conflict with a foreign power to defend that sovereignty, or what you think is a defense of sovereignty. And then the home islands of Japan are being bombed. So it almost seems like a kind of a tragedy when you watch it unfold as these sort of lines of defense, or these as Ishiwara Kanji used to refer to Manchuria as the national defense state. We're going to build this state in the northeast of Asia that's going to protect us from the Soviet Union, which prior to that would have been Korea. Prior to that would have been securing Japan's control over Hokkaido and Okinawa. So it's this kind of ever-growing sphere of control that almost becomes a kind of, what do you call it, an akujunkan, a kind of downward spiral, right? That you just keep, your security is never secure. And so it just drives expansion. But this techno-nationalism stuff is really about people making a kind of emotive connection to military technological achievements that are produced by their military.
Can I ask Sak something? Because we keep talking about the bombing of Japan, but LeMay, of course, was very much involved in the complete destruction of most of Korea. And he was very proud of it. And do you know about any kind of literature of the victims or any kind of resistance? Because LeMay, of course, got a medal from the Japanese emperor for building the Japanese, rebuilding the Japanese Air Force, right? But what is the relationship in Korea? Because in Japan, there's all this ambiguity towards America, and I guess at least in South Korea, I kind of wonder if there's any kind of talk about the bombing campaign there.
Wait, so the bombing campaign during the Korean War?
Yeah, Korean War, because it's something that
From Japan?
Forgotten about how we talk about, if we talk about any fire raids, we talk about the Japanese ones, right? But of course, the US bombed Korea to the Stone Age. That's what LeMay said, right? It didn't leave two stones standing or something. So I wonder if there's any kind of literature or any kind of people writing about the Korea War.
Korean War?
From the Korean point of view, the bombing campaign there.
Bombing campaign. I'm pretty sure there is. I'm not familiar with them. I'm sorry.
There's a pop history by David Halberstam called The Coldest Winter, which is very cinematic, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And I think that was the last book that he wrote before a tragic death in an automobile accident. But that book, by the way, has a couple of chapters are about the relationship between Truman and MacArthur, which is, I thought, quite well done. And then Bruce Cummings' 2 books on, the Korean War and the 2 Koreas. Well, I have I don't know, this is a bit of a wild card, but I had mentioned earlier Errol Morris's film, The Fog of War. And at the very beginning, Robert McNamara, being interviewed, says, as Secretary of Defense, he learned early on in press conferences, never ask the question you've then never answer the question you've been asked, answer the question you wish you'd been asked. So to the panelists, what question do you wish you'd been asked that you have not yet been asked? Or what issues would you like to address? You're just such a repository of information here. I really want to take advantage of your expertise while we have you.
Yeah, I want to first ask if there's anybody out there who didn't want that question, didn't have a chance to first, maybe. I have lots of things I can talk about, of course. If you don't mind me turning it around.
We have a number of people who made comments, not necessarily questions per se. And I've asked a couple of people who preferred not to speak publicly.
Okay, I can. One thing that I would like to talk about is branding, maybe. Again, because we're August 6th, I want to take it back to Hiroshima. We did it so many other places, which is really great because that's what I wanted this panel to be. We put Hiroshima in a much bigger context, which it is, and it doesn't happen enough in August 6th. But I want to talk about Hiroshima and the brand of Hiroshima, because there is a lot of discussion in Hiroshima about whether today about connection to the Olympics and whether today there will be, should have been or shouldn't have been a minute of silence during the Olympics. And there's a lot of discussion in Hiroshima, at least among activists I know, about how inappropriate it is, but also about how there is mutual branding going on. It's the brand of the IOC, Olympics is in peace, and the brand of Hiroshima, Hiroshima in peace. And we talked about heroism before and myth. Hiroshima has its own myths and own heroism. In many ways, there is a reason why we don't talk about a firebombing, and it comes from the centrality of Hiroshima, which obscure Nagasaki, first of all, right? Like Chad Deal was here before. I don't know if he's still here. But Hiroshima always stand for Nagasaki, but also it stands for Japanese victimization as a whole. Well, and it obscures the fire rates. And this have a reason in a history of politics of compensation and politics of reconstruction, because Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hiroshima, even more Nagasaki, got more money and before other Japanese cities to reconstruct because it presented itself as unique victims of atomic bomb. Hiroshima victims in their campaign to get compensation, which they truly deserved to, because of the Japanese government policy that refused to give them. The Japanese government basically say, if we give you money, we give money to everybody else. We give money to the bombing victims. So they felt, and they put, what their reply was that we're unique, we're special, right? So this actually led to a whole campaign of them presenting themselves. And of course, there's radiation and other things, but obscuring and denying compensation and recognition of fire victims. And a lot of it is because of Japanese government policy, but it's kind of an elephant in the room that no one talks about, the fire rates. Because we have this event in August 6th, we rarely have those events in March 10th, which is the bombing of Tokyo. And it's the bombing of Tokyo, right? As Aaron said, when do we commemorate the bombing of Toyama? Or the bombing of Kurume, or the bombing of all those small, tiny cities?
There's a question and raised by I believe it was Garen Malloy about my use of the term Irish conscripts. I assume they're North Irish conscripts because in the diary they just say Irishmen, so I assume they mean people from Northern Ireland. Obviously the British government's not conscripting people in Dublin to do its work, but I believe that's what the diarist is referring to, are North Irish.
Garen, you look like you have something to say on that.
Yeah.
Aaron, you and I have a lot of talk about it's going to be great when we finally meet in Scotland. Just that Northern Ireland didn't have conscription.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I don't know what the diarist is referring to then, now that you mention it, because they said Irish conscripts are cleaning up the dead bodies.
You see, one of the problems that you do find where people in Britain are talking about the Blitz, this does continue today, but particularly in the early 40s, you've got people in, let's say, generically the south of England, who hear people with accents maybe similar to my own, and believe they are some wild Celtic fringes who are barely tamed and barely walking upright. So that it's sometimes they make mistakes. As you know, can you believe Curtis LeMay? Can you believe diarists? So.
Yeah. No, and it's a legitimate question. It's something that we don't have time to get into in great depth. I have been looking through the mass observation data quite a lot, and again, we have a lot of problem with that data because the reports, which are I think they're digitized now fully, draw conclusions from raw materials that are in the boxes, right? So that the mass observers would have a series of materials, and then they would write a report based on the materials. And the conclusions drawn in the reports, I'm sure you know this, don't always follow what is in the materials. And in particular, there's been some really good scholarship about the Northwest, Manchester and Liverpool, where they say, well, people in Manchester are basically a bunch of whingers because they're used to being, and mind you, this is the 1930s or the 1940s, because they're rich. This is the rich city, whereas the Liverpudlians are hardy sailors and they just take the bombing with a laugh. And then you these kind of regional assumptions that the mass observers make. But then when you dig down into the materials, actually they're all pretty miserable throughout the whole duration, but one of the things I didn't get a chance to get into this, and it's one of the reasons why I like doing this from the ground up, even though you do sometimes get into trouble, as with Irish conscripts, is that they kind of highlight things that we don't really pay as much attention to when we talk about the experience of the war years. One being, I can't think of any other way to put it, but the death of good times, right? That people really do feel continually immiserated. I mean, you think about what we've been through with the pandemic and how much complaining and moaning people have done because they can't take a holiday in Benidorm or whatever. People went through a war experience where, it was hard to go to the cinema. I've had colleagues point out to me, why are you talking so much about Manchester? Manchester wasn't bombed that much. And I said, yeah, but all you had to do is drop a few bombs in the city center and the whole public transport system's paralyzed. And that means someone who's living, out in, somewhere in the Cheshire Plains can't go in to see a movie, go to a dance hall, or get a drink. They basically have been deprived. Whereas Liverpool didn't have that problem, apparently. The transport system held up pretty well. This is kind of in the trees a little bit, but I'm just using this as an example of when we work from sort of the ground up, there's particularly these social histories, we get some very interesting portrayals. And then you can tie that into, people in places like Akita saying like, what I really hate about this war is I can't play baseball. Why can't I play baseball anymore? I remember reading a schoolgirl's diary and she was saying, I wanted to go, buy some German literature, but now we're all being told by our school headmaster that Germany is a fallen nation and because they surrendered, I shouldn't be reading the literature of losers. And it was just sort of, when is this going to end? When can I actually get back to leading a fulfilling life? And there's a kind of, resentment building up from that I think informs a lot of post-war Japanese pacifism as well, saying we don't want to go through this again. And we saw it with Ken Loach's film Spirit of 46 to a certain extent as well. Where people who had went through the war years said, voted out or had a real kind of anti-conservative point of view, whether they were, actual conservatives before the war or not, because, they saw the Conservative Party as representing a return to the pre-war status quo, and they were not having it after the war years. So that those sorts of, you can see how both of these communities in Japan and Britain really came out of the war years with a different kind of consciousness about what the state should be doing and when should we be at war and so on. And I think that's probably, I mean, if you really wanted to, if I was going to, I don't know why I always do this, but maybe I'm a masochist. If you really want to critique my work, what you'd say is Aaron has written a book about the Second World War in Japan and Britain, where he's trying to take this sort of, grassroots, not so much victimization, but the suffering element of the war year and transposed it to Britain, where it's inappropriate, depending on where, who you might ask, because the British all just came together and got through the war years. And I'm saying, no, I don't see that so much, in the social, there is this sort of coming together and the unity stuff, but you can find that in Japan too. So if we really wanted to, we could take the British consciousness of pulling together, achieving unity, neighbors helping each other, and transport it to Japan and say, look, Japan's experience of the war years is not unending misery and death. There are other things going on. I think Brock Kushner has written a really good article about humor in the war years, who laughed during World War II. There are all kinds of stories you can tell, but I thought, no, the bigger beast that I want to go after in this is the nostalgia, right? And there's this constant nostalgia we see. I was at Duxford recently and just seeing, you can buy a ration book and you can, and I just thought, the stuff that I read in the memoir literature in particular, but also the diaries, it's just how absolutely miserable people are during the war years. And so I'm not really in a mood to celebrate it. And so I kind of want to get back to this, what Sayaka may feel like it's a bit fusty, this sort of older, Japanese view of the war years, which is, people were hungry, they couldn't go to the cinema, the cities are being destroyed. There's really nothing to celebrate there. Can we please not celebrate it? So again, there you go. I fed my enemies here's how you attack my book. Let's just say he's taken this, peace movement narrative of wartime Japan, and he's transported it to Britain, and it doesn't work. I rather think that it does, and I'm trying to bring it back.
Aaron, I feel like I should intercede here before you die the death of 1,000 self-inflicted cuts. But the saving grace is you whatever you've written, you have not written it at a 6th grade level. So we're at a little over 2 hours, and I had purposely kept this open-ended. I've always wondered why, you get 6 panelists and people go for an hour and people have a lot left unsaid. So I don't want to wear everyone out, but we do have 38 people here, and we're not likely to convene this session again anytime soon. And so I do want to, as long as your energy and motivation holds up, I would like to elicit more, information. And I don't know, perhaps because you know each other's work, Aaron, Sayaka, and Ron, you could put questions to each other. Your work is obviously simpatico and like-minded
I have
people.
one question I'd like to ask Sayaka and Ron, and it might be of interest to the other panelists. I've always been curious as to why people form emotional attachments to certain historical narratives. For example, that the atomic bombing ended the war quickly and saved lives, or that the Japanese people were unwitting victims of the bombing campaign. And so rather than interrogating whether these narratives are true or false, or how we want to use them or attack them or analyze them, I'm curious why we think, because there's a lot of history activism. Sayaka was kind of blunted with a lot of this stuff recently due to the comfort women side of things. And people are obviously very attached to certain kinds of historical narrative, particularly for World War II, right? I mean, it is surprisingly, if you made a sort of similar argument that could provoke people of a certain political background about the Korean War, they might not be as fired up about it in Japan or the United States. The Second World War really touches a nerve. And I'm just curious, and these are not people who went through the war. They're not even necessarily people who have relatives who were in the war. Or if I say to people in Britain, people were miserable in the war years and it wasn't as unified as you think it was. I mean, look at this Mass Observer writing down graffiti in bathrooms, people talking about wanting to shoot Churchill. There's this whole kind of other side of it that we're not seeing. Why are people so attached to presenting the war in a certain way?
Interesting question. I think people will always emotions, and I think they attach emotions to certain family memory, community memory throughout the history. We just found that expression to understand it as their emotional expression rather than rational, understanding of the facts, because we can't possibly explain why they believe in that way other than, well, they have an emotional attachment to it. So I figure that phenomenon itself is not specific to recent World War II, but as you said, World War II does trigger a lot of emotions, that's for sure. But different, comfort women issue is obviously in World War II, but I think it has its own emotional sort of configuration for people. I think it's a combination of sort of deep down racist feeling against Korean people, plus deep down misogyny which doesn't want to believe women's stories combined. So, and that happened during World War II. So I think that it's much bigger or smaller, whatever in your definition, but it's more specific than just I have to be very emotional about World War II and what comfort women definitely is one of those issues. It just cannot. If I kept reading this year for the first time, I had to read a lot of right-wingers' writings about comfort women, and there, believe it or not, there are many strands of right-wingers, and they don't necessarily agree with each other, except on the comfort women issue, which is really interesting for me. But that's another issue from wartime memory. In my view, it's about women. It's about racism.
I think for me, it's about how aesthetic and beautiful and cinematic World War II is. And it's like, I had this conversation with Shel Garon where I was talking about how Gladwell is aestheticizing the bombing. Gladwell has this passage when he talks about how beautiful the Tokyo bombing was. And I thought, this is aestheticizing violence and it's fascist, and Shel didn't really like it, but I think this is our main problem, the fact that we make war beautiful. If you go to any American museum, World War II is this beautiful, wonderful thing that happened. If you go to a lot of Japanese museums, not the peace museum, but the big ones, if you go to Yamato Museum in Kure, like if you get anything to do with Yamato, the Yamato, the big battleship, it's all about this beautiful ship and this great sacrifice. Was 3,000 young men that died in order to make a new Japan. That's how they sell it. It's so stupid. I mean, there's no reason why they died. They just died. They didn't have any impact on the war. It was one of the stupidest, most tragic things that happened. But there is this drive in Japan, in America, and all those countries to make sense of this senseless, tragic event. And World War II is the biggest senseless, tragic, stupid thing that ever happened, right? I mean, so many people have to make sense of it, and it became such a big thing, and it lives in so many different movies, and I don't think there's any other conflict that was ever so much was written on.
I forget who said it, that all war movies are inherently pro-war, celebration of war, just by their vivid cinematic scope.
Yeah, if anybody go to Hiroshima, please go down to Kure. It's like 25 minutes down the rail line, and go to the Yamato Museum. It's like the complete opposite of the Peace Museum. And you need to see both in order to really understand how complex Japanese ideas World War II.
I think it's also, isn't it, that we're now in the phase in which the Second World War is becoming memory. In much the same way we went through that phase not that long ago with the First World War, where those who lived through the war years are passing on. And so we're seeing a kind of struggle over what kind of narrative is going to be enshrined when it no longer becomes a kind of community-based memory, where you still have the children of World War II veterans and victims who are going to advocate, but some of it too feels like transition to a different era, because the post-war order that was built out of the Second World War's violence feels like it's coming to an end. And so I think that might be triggering some powerful emotions in people that they're maybe not thinking about, myself included, about whether Japan is going to significantly rearm itself, and whether the United States is going to get involved in another war during an arms race in the South China Sea, and these sorts of things. These are all becoming very live issues. So I wonder if that might be feeding some of the energy as well, that the Manichaean narratives of good and evil are kind of coming to an end of the Second World War, and the order that then came from that that conflict is also going to be finished.
Well, it was a couple of decades after the Vietnam War that the first truly great films about Vietnam, like Platoon, Apocalypse Now, etc. I wonder what films will be made about Afghanistan. That really defies a neat, simplistic narrative.
Mm.
Well, Ron, when we first started talking about these issues, I had read your and Aaron's essay and was very impressed by that. I'm going to assign it to my class, as I will assign this webinar. So thank you for all this great information. But we had talked about conjoining it to a larger discussion about, the firebombing of Tokyo. And what we have here is a very inclusive title, at least, in which we're talking about the transition from total war to nuclear war. But we have talked about revisiting these issues next spring as we start to approach that anniversary. Ron, could you connect those dots a little bit and, talk through the title and what's embedded in that?
Well, we wanted to initially include David Fedman, Kari Caracas, and many other people who were much more knowledgeable about the bombing campaign. They have their great website. Aaron, what's the title of it?
Airraids.org.
Airraids.org, which I urge everybody to look at. And they have all those images, and they worked on it for far longer than me and Aaron have. And Shel Garon is now finishing a book about us. But one thing, and we have this whole other email exchange and ranting about Gladwell, where we talk, a lot of what we talk about was about total war and why it's all connected to total war and totality of war. The reason why they bomb civilians is because civilians seen as part of this total war effort. And this is where I think Sayaka's work coming in, this total war, because what we think of total war usually is a total national mobilization. What Sayaka thinks, and I think her book is showing, is it's total imperial mobilization. You can't really say this ends up in the nation. So in March 6th, I hope we can enlarge the conversation and talk about bombing as part of the whole total war experience, and talk about all different ways that the war was indeed total and impacted every aspect of people's lives all over the world, and not just in nation, but also in various other contexts.
Okay. Aaron, Sayaka, do you have any concluding comments? I think we're building up a pretty robust reading list here as we're working through these issues.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for questions and comments. And I learned a lot from Aaron and Ran, and I had fun. Sorry, my brain is kind of shutting down. It's 9 p.m.
We have gone on rather late. And I guess it's early in the morning there for you, Aaron?
No, it's a very comfortable afternoon. I'm sitting here sipping my coffee and watching Ron and Sayaka grind down, and you, Kyle, as well.
Well, it's not as early as it was 2 hours ago, Ron.
So, no, I mean, it started at lunchtime. I think the Americans, if they're here, are probably rubbing their eyes a little bit and wanting a nap.
Well, we'll wrap it up here. I want to thank you so much for this. It's a really superb discussion by some very serious scholars. And, it motivates me to study this. And by association, my students will be studying and reading your work as well. So, I hope to revisit these issues and to rely on the network of scholars that you're associated with. I mean, one of the discussions that Ron and I had is that when we went through a list, rather quickly of prospective panelists, we were at 8 or 10 people. And obviously that wouldn't be a very functional webinar, and people don't have time to speak. So maybe we can do this, if not as an ongoing series, then certainly next spring. And I just want to thank you for taking the time for this great content. And it's a great contribution to our university. I want to mention just quickly about our institute. Temple University, Japan, has been in Tokyo since, I don't know, the early 1980s. We have about 1,200 undergraduate students, a couple of graduate programs. In our Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, we normally do 30 to 40 public events, but because we've gone online, we're doing these webinars. But we do have an ongoing series of these. And if you go to our website, this is ICAS, or Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, those listings are there. If you want to send an email to me, I will put my email address here in the chat before we go. We can add you to the mailing list. And so we'll sign off for now. Sayaka, Aaron, Ron, and all the great questions that came to us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care.